Suddenly, an experience that had been around forever, that was talked about by Plato, for example, but it was very rare. But suddenly in the 60s and 70s, what was once extremely rare was now very common.
Welcome to the crossroads of the known and the unknown. This is AJ Parr's Spiritual Journalist Podcast.
I am here with Dr. Raymond Moody and Paul Perry. They have written around 6 books together. Welcome.
Hi. Thank you so much, AJ, for this opportunity.
I was talking to Paul the other day because we want to record you talking about your different books. So what can you mention about The Light Beyond, Dr. Moody?
Well, at that time when we wrote that book was about 88 or so, 87. And I was, Life After Life had been published for about 10 years. And so a lot of information had accumulated. And so Paul and I did that to put together a lot of things that happened in the interim, including all the doctors who had gotten involved in this, right. And had found amazing things. We talked about Dr. Melvin Morse, who was a pediatrician who had studied children's near-death experiences.
I was living in New York City, and I was editing a very large consumer health magazine called American Health Magazine. It was the most successful magazine of the 1980s. We went from no circulation to over 1 million in just a few months. And that just shows how hungry people were for health information. Anyway, one day my agent called me, Nat Sobel, and he said, let's go to lunch. I want to talk to you about Raymond Moody. I didn't know who Raymond was. And so I went to lunch, and Nat says, I have this guy in Atlanta who needs some help finishing a book. And his name is Dr. Raymond Moody. And he expected a response from me. And I said, I don't know who Raymond Moody is. And he says, well, he named and defined the near-death experience. And I said, I don't know what a near-death experience is. And he said, what's wrong with you? Don't you watch Oprah? And I said, no, I don't. And so he explained to me what a near-death experience was. And he said, if you're going to edit a major health magazine, you need to know what a near-death experience is, because people are going to start talking about them. And so I flew down to Atlanta to see Raymond, and we just had an immediate bond. I was very interested in what he was doing, and he was interested in talking about it and having another book. And that was really our initial meeting with each other, is that we really bonded very quickly.
In that book, The Light Beyond was the first case in detail we talked of the shared death experiences. Right. At Fort Dix, New Jersey, I was lecturing into the Army chaplain corps, and a young sergeant who was there came up afterward, and he told me that sometime before he had been admitted to the hospital suddenly. I forgot for what illness, but he had a cardiac arrest in the hospital. Unbeknownst to him, his sister, who had suffered from diabetes for a long time, was admitted to the hospital at the same time, unbeknownst to each other. And she died. And the young man was revived and returned. And so when he came back, he said that he had met his sister in the hospital and had said goodbye to her. And since she died in the same hospital that he was being resuscitated.
I was working on 2 books at the same time. One was The Light Beyond with Raymond Moody about near-death experiences. The other was with Dr. Herman Hellerstein at Case Western University in Cleveland. And it was a book about reversing heart disease. So what we're dealing with here is 2 very different types of doctors, especially for the time. Raymond is a psychiatrist, and he tends to be more spiritual and questioning. And Dr. Hellerstein was a cardiologists. You know, they walk a straight road. So I was at the hospital in Cleveland. I was talking to Dr. Hellerstein, and we were in a nurse's station. And he said to me, "What else are you working on besides this book?" And I told him, I said, "I'm doing a book about near-death experiences." And he says, "You know, I've resuscitated hundreds of people, and I've never, ever heard of a near-death experience. And I don't think they exist." And so we talked for a while, and then he had a call, so he had to leave the nurses' station. And as soon as he left, all the nurses came over to me, and they said, the reason he's never heard a near-death experience is because he doesn't talk to the patients. And we talk to the patients, and we hear them all the time. And they stood there and they told me several near-death experiences that they had witnessed. And I think that was a period in time when doctors didn't accept any kind of spirituality. Maybe I'm making a gross judgment on that, but I don't feel that I am. And later on, as a new generation of doctors came along, they started to read Raymond Moody's book, Life After Life. They understood things about near-death experiences, but they also then felt free to believe their patients. When their patients said, "You know, I left my body and I watched you do surgery on me." In the era of Dr. Hellerstein, they would have dismissed that. But then everything started to change.
Some people ask, you know, were you encouraged when other doctors took this up? And in a way I was, but I always knew it would happen. I mean, see, people often treat me as kind of heroic, AJ, for coming across this. But the reason I was able to do this book was that in the 60s and 70s, with the development of cardiopulmonary resuscitation, suddenly an experience that had been around forever, that was talked about by Plato, for example, but it was very rare. But suddenly in the 60s and 70s, what was once extremely rare was now very common. So that's, you know, why that book took off. And I knew full well when it was published that, you know, it would fall into the hands of some doctors and psychologists who at first might be dubious and say, but now let me just ask among my patients. And I knew that when they did, they would find the same thing. So it's anybody now who has this experience, I think, should no longer feel any reluctance to talk about it, because it's something that is very well understood now, I think.
And until now, I get a large number of doctors talking to me about near-death experiences, ones that they've had or ones that they've witnessed through other patients. So times have changed a lot. And we now have a medical establishment that isn't so establishment anymore, that it won't accept a spiritual experience.
What about Glimpses of Eternity? You wrote this book and it was about shared death experiences exclusively, right?
It was really, in actual fact, the first book about shared death experiences, period. There were several books that contained shared death experiences, like all of ours did. One day, we're sitting on Raymond's porch, and it had to set the scene. Raymond is rocking, of course, like he was at the porch, and we were right on the creek. It was noisy creek. I have all the audio tapes. It's really kind of fascinating. And we started talking about, and we were working on another book, a different book. But we started talking about shared death experiences. And we realized that we had both had a shared death experience. Mine happened when my mother was dying of dementia. And I was preparing to leave for the care facility because she was getting worse and worse, when I got a call from Vernon Neppy. Neppy was the head of neuropharmacology at University of Washington in Seattle. And I had worked with Vernon on a book project maybe 5 or 6 years earlier, but I had not communicated with him since then. no phone calls, no emails, no nothing. And he called me and he immediately said, I was sitting at a kitchen table today reading the newspaper, and a female voice said, "Call Paul Perry." And I ignored it. And within a few minutes, I heard the voice again say, "Call Paul Perry." So here I am calling as ordered, and I don't know why. And his medical field matched perfectly with my mother's disease. You know, she had dementia or Alzheimer's. And so I told him what was wrong with her, and asked if there were any new medications or any new therapy that I could use. And he gave me some advice. And in the midst of this advice, I got another phone call coming in. And I said, "Vernon, I've got to take this call." And I answered it, and it was the care facility telling me that my mother had just passed away. Now, that's, of course, a pretty good shared death experience for a number of reasons. And so we talked about that, and then Raymond talked about his own shared death experience.
Yeah.
And
As my mom was dying, it's again, AJ, words fail, as you know, but it's, for want of a better term, as my mother was dying, we were no longer in a three-dimensional space in a hospital room. It was an indefinable space, a non-three-dimensional geometry. It's like you couldn't tell where you were looking at things from. And my mother, the room was filled to me with light and energy that was moving. It's moving, but not in the sense that visible. It was like things were just dynamic. And I heard my mother twice say, "I love you," but her mouth wasn't moving. But it was very echoing, loud. And my wife experienced something. My sister felt the presence of my father, who had died 18 months before. My brother-in-law experienced something. And so I had been studying these shared death experiences before, but oddly enough, hearing that, having it myself, you have to process it at a different level, right? So I backed away from the research for a while just to figure out what was that, processing my own stuff. But then, went back. You hear the most astonishing things from people.
I had a shared death experience also with my mother, or I don't know if it was a shared death experience or an afterlife visitation. I was working late at night and I felt someone standing behind me. I turned around, there was no one there, and I continued working. I felt someone was behind me once again, and I turned and there was no one there. So I went to sleep, and the following morning they told me my mother had passed right around the time where I sensed this. So I said, wow, that was my mother.
Yeah, these are amazing experiences.
Yes, they are.
This has been the AJ Parr Spiritual Journalist Podcast. Please like, share, and subscribe.